Welcome to Minority Matters. I'm your host, Sylvester Smith. In our show last month, we talked about the upcoming political election, which is now behind us. This month, I brought back our esteemed political panel to talk about what's going to happen next. With me, I have Dr. Price Dooley. Dr. Dooley is a professor of political science at the University of Central Arkansas. And also I have Mr. Lamar Davis. Lamar is the Deputy Chief of Staff in the office of Governor Mike Beebe.
Good to be with you.
I think we'll start off with opening statements. And last time we gave Mr. Davis the honor, so this time we'll give it to you, Dr. Dooley. What are your overarching thoughts about the general election?
Well, you look at the general election and you look at the national level, you saw Republicans holding their own in the House, lost roughly about 8 seats so far, but still holding control of the House. You saw some of the sort of fringe Tea Party candidates in the Senate end up losing. You saw a very unpopular Democrat in Missouri winning because she went up against a sort of a fringe Tea Party-oriented candidate. You saw a president who did something that in the modern era only 3 other presidents have done. There have only been 4 presidents in the modern era that have garnered 50% of the vote and 2 terms. That's Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Eisenhower, Ronald Reagan, and Barack Obama. So that says a whole lot. As it relates to the state of Arkansas, you saw the Republican wave come in as expected, winning 21 of 35 seats in the Senate, 51 of 49 in the House, but with some surprising twists that actually have occurred, and I'd love to go ahead and talk about that as it relates to the newly minted Republican Speaker of the House.
Great. Mr. Davis?
I think it was a sweeping victory for President Obama on the national level. If you think about all the things he had to overcome, unemployment is relatively high. You had a very recalcitrant Congress who said, you know, our number one priority is to defeat the president. You had other economic factors that were a drag on his administration. You had voter suppression that resurfaced again in Wisconsin, in Ohio, and Florida. So he overcame all these things and had a wide margin in the Electoral College. I thought the popular vote was significant as well. So I think his achievement is historic for a second term. It also says a lot about America and where we are on the question of race to reelect the African-American president as well. On the state level, I would have to disagree about the Republican tidal wave. I think there were some projections saying that in the House they would have 60 seats or plus. That was not the case. And I do think in the Senate you have more moderate Republicans elected. And as you and I have discussed, if you look at the chairmanship roles and the vice chair roles, I think that is more of a bipartisan body. So I think here in Arkansas, we're going to have to find ways to compromise if we're going to have any meaningful agenda.
Well, let me go back to something you just said, Dr. Dooley. You referenced the Tea Party and those Tea Party-aligned candidates for U.S. Senate and in the U.S. House that lost their races. Now, you and I, in our personal history, when you were a candidate for State House here, you said one of the reasons you were running is because you felt the Tea Party was pulling the Republican Party too far to the right. Do you believe that helped to contribute to the outcome in these national races?
Definitely. I mean, I think when you look at the Missouri race, with again Claire McCaskill going against a hardcore Tea Party conservative who made some comments that were beyond the pale. You see her winning and winning fairly comfortably. You look at Indiana, a solidly conservative state, a state that the president won last time, but has kind of sort of trended to be more toward the Republican conservative side. You see almost a guaranteed slam dunk senatorial candidate losing because they were the Tea Party that knocked off the mainstream, mainline Republican candidate. I think nationally and locally to a lesser extent, but nationally, there is a battle for the hearts and minds of the Republican Party and for the future of the party. Is the Republican Party going to be a party that's going to be pulled too far to the right by intransigent Tea Party folks who aren't willing to compromise, or we're going to return to sort of a Republican era that's based on Herbert Walker Bush or Eisenhower or W. So from that standpoint, I'm not really sure, but there is a battle going on. And also here in Arkansas, we typically are about 5 to 10 years behind, it seems, as far as the curve is concerned, being the last southern state to actually fall or switch to the Republican end of it. But we'll see what happens.
Well, I remember in the 2010, the run-up to the 2010 election cycle, being at a rally at the state capitol, just there as a interested political observer, watching this huge Tea Party event, and there were hundreds upon hundreds of people there, many of whom, if you spoke to them in the crowd, would say they hadn't voted in years, but they were energized about participating in the political process. And I think we saw in 2010 the positive impact that that movement had for the Republican Party. I think it's very reasonable to argue that in 2012, in many races, that movement had the opposite effect. So, Lamar, I'll ask you, moving forward, is the Tea Party going to be something that benefits the Democratic Party more than it does the Republican Party?
I think it can. I agree with Dr. Dooley in that there is a struggle right now for the identity, I think, of the Republican Party. I think President Obama was able to win for a number of reasons. One, likability factor. Americans like and trust this president. Whether or not the economy is where it needs to be, they like him, they believe he's trying, they trust what he says. Second thing is messaging. I think the Republican Party, because of the Tea Party, was not able to promote a coherent strategic message. They were the party of no. They were the party of small government. They were the party of cut, where there were no solutions offered. And that, I think, was a tragic mistake. And finally, the numbers, I think, was a way that President Obama was able to win. He was able to expand his base. If you look at key constituent groups, young women, LGBT community, African Americans, Latino communities, I think that was the way to win, expand the base and not frighten the middle. When you think about the Tea Party, you've got this division that's all far right. It's pulling the mainstream Republican Party off their message points, and as a result, they can't compete.
Well, you look like you have something on your mind.
that was a really strong word to say in terms of they can't compete. I'll make the argument that nationally, the Republican Party does have an image problem. Nationally, very competitive. I mean, from that standpoint, we're still looking at a race that was decided by roughly about 3 million votes. So from that standpoint, I would say that it's not necessarily the competition. There is a changing demographic in the United States. When you look at the growth of Latinos across the country, the Republican Party and conservatism has to do a much better job of reaching out to Latinos. And I would say African Americans as well. But that sort of has been the overarching, I think, takeaway from the national election. Locally, in the state of Arkansas, I do want to point out that Democratic Party rule has ended for the first time in 138 years. So we do have a Republican House, a Republican Senate, and 3 out of the 7 statewide offices are held by Republicans now. And so you are seeing this trend that's actually moving. My concern is what type of conservatism are we going to have? Are we going to have a conservatism that actually works for the people of Arkansas and works for the American people? Or are we going to have a fringe element that sort of makes the Republican Party turn into the party of no? And that's really the key.
Well, here's something that I observed early on that there has not been much discussion about in the election postmortem, and that's the effect of Mitt Romney's religion on voters. This would have been the first time in American history that we had a Mormon that became president of the United States. And yet there are many Americans have a lot of discomfort, and there's a lot of miseducation about the Mormon faith. Do you all think that had any impact at all on the outcome of the election?
I don't think he ever got to that point. And here's why I said it's the Republican Party, as it stands right now, is not competitive. If you look at all the outside money that was spent, if you look at the money that was spent to beat the incumbent president, if you look at the negative attack ads, if you look at the messaging, if you look at who they appeal to, you take all those things, and they only gained two more states, right? They only took back Indiana and North Carolina. And if you look at the gap electoral college, which is how we elect our president, that's not competitive. That's not a formula that's going to make you competitive in 2016. So I don't think you can still do the same old thing, the same Southern strategy, the same divide and conquer thing that Republicans have done on a national level and expect to do any better than you did before, because the changing demographics are such that the message is not appealing to the more popular people. We're going to be more black and brown and single women, and the LGBT community is increasing. And so if you want to be a successful fisherman, you have to fish where the fish are. And the Republican Party has not been able to do that. On the state level, I think it's a little different. I will agree. But you still see the Tea Party influence on that level. Your question was about Mitt Romney's faith. I don't think you ever got to that point. I think the Democratic Party on a national level was very inclusive. They've always been. It's a big tent. You probably have a significant number of Mormons who are part of that movement as well.
Well, yeah, I would say I would agree with you that as far as his faith never really was a factor. And an interesting thing about it was, in my view, you saw evangelicals sort of embracing a Mormon nominee, which was a little unusual. I will say that again, the Republican Party nationally, when you look at family values and conservatism and those types of things, it has a natural resonance as relates to the Latino community. And when you look, and the Latino community is still up for grabs. Romney fared very abysmally among the Latino community. Romney fared abysmally among the African American community. It's forgotten that George W. Bush, former President Bush, garnered 11% of the African American vote, not by tokenism or a la Newt Gingrich, but by really, and I think entrusting black and brown folks and talking to them, having a conversation. So that's really is sort of the key. I think the message is wrong because of the Tea Party. I think that it resonates not so well nationally and locally. But ultimately, though, I think there is some inroads that can be made by a good Republican, a solid Republican candidate.
Well, let me ask you this: how do Republicans make those inroads?
Well, I think that Republicans need to stop talking down to folks. I think there are some Republican candidates that kind of talk down to folks or kind of talk in caricature. I think you talk to a person with respect, and you convey your perspective and your message in terms of how the principles of conservatism can actually benefit or help them. And so from that standpoint, I think that's what's important. And I think there was a miscalculation in terms of that there was this desire, this widespread desire that was out there for government to do less. When you poll the American people, when you poll Arkansans, people don't necessarily want government to do less. They want government to be more efficient. They want government to go ahead and help them. They want government to be relevant. And so from that standpoint, I think that the messaging was wrong nationally. And to a lesser extent, in terms of maybe the margin of victory, and I want to return to that comment about the Arkansas State Legislature in terms of not garnering the 60% in the Arkansas Legislature. I want to really want to address that issue.
We'll get back to that, definitely. Well, let me ask you this, Mr. Davis, because when I was working in the Huckabee administration, it was my job to go out here and not only help create the message that would be communicated in the minority communities, but to be an ambassador that would deliver the message. And to Dr. Dooley's point, the numbers in the past do suggest that minorities, African Americans included in that group, would support a Republican as they did with Bush. What are your thoughts? Is what we've seen in the 08 and 12 cycle indicative of the future, or is it just a coincidence of having an African American Democratic nominee?
I don't think it's a coincidence, and I agree with you that African Americans, they're not so monolithic as we once were. I think there is room for the Republican Party to make some inroads, but you've got to change the rhetoric, as you alluded to. There's this notion that socially African Americans are conservative. If you talk about social conservatism in a responsible manner, I think that's appealing. But at the same time, you can't have three candidates from your party talking about slavery and deporting all Muslims and doing all those things. The Republican Party should have admonished those candidates. They should have said, we won't seat them. They should have taken a stronger stance. If you do those kind of things, that lets African American voters know where you are. You talked about Latinos, but you got Mitt Romney saying things like self-deportation. Well, he's never going to appeal to Latinos or fair-minded Americans when the rhetoric comes straight from the Tea Party playbook. So You're right. The message has to change. And yes, I think there is a possibility that African Americans can be susceptible to a responsible Republican message.
Well, and for the sake of fairness, the Republican Party chairman, Doyle Webb, did come out and admonish those 3 legislative candidates. And I know Congressman Griffin, for one, demanded that his campaign contributions be returned or given to charity. So, but to Mr. Davis's point, Mr. Dooley, there was a large sector of the Republican infrastructure here in Arkansas that we didn't hear a thing from. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's unfortunate. And I think, but that also kind of goes to the earlier point in terms of Arkansas isn't exactly where the national mood is right now. Arkansas is a southern state, traditionalistic political culture, and with that is sort of, you know, in another spot right now. I would say that most Republicans, mainline Republicans that I know and I spoke with, thought that those comments were abhorrent. I thought they were abhorrent. I think on the previous show I even made that comment. Mm-hmm. But at some point we've got to move beyond what's happened. Also, all 3 of them lost, by the way. All 3 of them lost, and they lost pretty handily. So I think that says something about the Arkansas people in terms of their ability to go ahead and make a determination along those lines. Elections have consequences. They made those comments, and they didn't win. So which is what I would sort of wrap it by saying.
Well, a couple more quick questions about the national election and national politics, then we'll move on to focus specifically to Arkansas. What are your predictions now that we have President Obama reelected? He can veto any effort to attack his signature piece of legislation, that being health care reform. But he's got this Republican majority in the House that he's got to work with. So with regard to health care reform, do you think health care reform is here to stay? Or do you think that it'll be chipped at? Or do you think that it'll be repealed? I'll start with you, Mr. Davis.
I think some version of health care reform is here to stay. I don't think there's a perfect sausage that was made the last time. I think there are going to be additives taken in and added to that process. I think right now the president is shifting from election, post-election to governing mode. He doesn't have to worry about another election. He's worried about legacy. I think he'll follow along the lines of Bill Clinton when he lost the House and how he came back and governed from the center. And I think this president, because of his likability factor, has the notion of pulling people together. I think American people want to rally around him. So I think we're going to see a big shift in D.C.
Well, and with regard, Dr. Dooley, what is your response to that? And also your prediction with whether or not there'll be a compromise reached on the budget?
Well, I think that health care, PPACA, ACA, Obamacare is a law of the land. The Supreme Court has upheld it. We've had an election. Elections have consequences. Elections matter. So I think that as it's being implemented, it will continue to be implemented. You've got the Department of Labor. You've got a couple of other agencies that actually have to go about promulgating regulations for that. So I think it's going to be the law of the land, and that's where we are. As it relates to the physical cliff, you know, I believe some deal may be cut. I'm not quite as optimistic as Lamar. I really think that the nature of Washington is for it not to go ahead and function, and that it doesn't function very well or very effectively. I really think that I don't think you're going to get enough Republicans to go ahead and agree to enough revenue increases to go ahead and satisfy the Democratic majority. I don't think you're going to get enough Democrats to go ahead and agree for the level of cuts that need to actually go ahead and happen. So for me, and this is going to be kind of a semi-radical prediction, but I think we're going to go over the physical cliff. I think if you look at the Congressional Budget Office's projections, that puts us into recession for 2013, but it also in 2014 pulls us out of that because we've got basically $600 billion of both revenue increases and spending cuts that actually will go into effect in next year. If you want to handle this budget deficit, shared sacrifice up and down the line, both on the cutting end and both on the revenue increase end. So for me, I'm thinking there's not going to be a deal.
You mentioned something at the beginning, and you asked if the president has a mandate. If you look at the numbers, Electoral College, it seems like a mandate, but you break down the popular vote, you can make an argument that he doesn't. I think the American people clearly gave him a mandate to get something done. And I think governors are a good bell cow in terms of finding out where people are. If you look at the number of governors who have now said, I want to look at this Affordable Care Act again. I mean, you look at Florida, you look at Wisconsin, you look at Bobby Jindal. who I think is a rising star in your party, they're now saying, okay, let's look at this thing another time, because there are people who are going to be hurting if we don't do this. I think those same people are screaming to their congressmen and to their senators, we want you to get something done. We can't stand the recession, and yes, you're right about that. We can't stand the recession in 2013 and come back in 2014. We're sending you to Congress now to get something done. And I think I'm optimistic, yes, you're right, that we'll get something done.
Well, let's now talk about Arkansas specifically. There are some who argue that now that we have a Republican majority in both houses of the legislature and the Democratic governor, that the Arkansas state legislature will function the way the Congress does, or dysfunction, as you so eloquently put, Dr. Dooley. What are your predictions with regard to that? We'll start with you, Doc.
Well, I'll just say this. I mean, unlike Congress at the national level, it takes a simple majority to go ahead and pass legislation in the Arkansas House and the Arkansas Senate. So now there is a slight difference as it relates to revenue. Revenue issues will take 75%. But as far as values voting, as far as values legislation and restrictions and on liberty one way or the other, those can actually be outputted very, very simply with simple majorities. So from that standpoint, I really do feel like that if looking at from the other side of the aisle, that you guys missed an extraordinary opportunity to go ahead and sort of frustrate that. So for me, I do see the Republican majority in both the House and the Senate being able to go ahead and dictate policy in a pretty decent manner. I mean, other than revenue oriented types of things. We're looking at, but one last thing. Well, I just want to move on just for one other thing too. I just want to go ahead and say that as it relates though to the speakership though, governing is different from challenging. And so when you saw Terry Rice, who was supposed to be the sort of the incoming Republican designated speaker, now you've got
Davy Carter.
Davy Carter, who now is this sort of young gun rising star with Democrats and young Republicans working together. It's going to make for a very, very interesting legislative session coming up next year.
One of the things that we talked about on the last show was the possibility that Darren Williams would become the first African-American speaker. He didn't. Mr. Davis, Republicans played a key role in making sure that Mr. Williams did not become speaker. If the Democrats had been in the place of the Republicans and the Democrats had an opportunity to vote out the man who would have been the first African-American Speaker of the House as a Republican, do you think they would have done so?
That's a great question, and I can't answer that question. I think the Democratic Party has had this loyalty with African Americans, and I think there would have been a much stronger call for them to say, let's put partisanship aside and let's look at history and how we want to be viewed nationally and in the world. I will say, though, that before we talk about Darren's race, I think we have to talk about his qualifications. This is a Vanderbilt lawyer, successful business person, good family person. Heads above all, I think he was the single best candidate for Speaker of the House. And so I think the Republicans missed it. We were talking about appealing to African Americans. They missed an opportunity here. Darren gave a very warm speech about bipartisanship and said, let's not look on it on the lines of Democrat and Republican. Let's look on qualifications, and Republicans missed that opportunity.
That's a very esoteric argument to go ahead and have. I think the people of Arkansas, I mean, to be very honest with you, I mean, aren't really concerned so much about making history from that standpoint, but they want to make history in terms of turning Arkansas around from going from the 50th state maybe into a top 10. So from that standpoint, I think the perspective is, and I think you acknowledge this, a party has the right to go ahead and vote for their leadership in terms of how they want to, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of gender or anything else. And so from that standpoint, Darren Williams definitely has the qualifications. He definitely would have made a great speaker. Darren Williams also did make history by being the first African-American speaker designate. So we can at least say that from as far as moving down the aisles of history, the halls of history, that Arkansas has done pretty well from that standpoint. But I think elections have consequences. 44 votes up in southeast Arkansas. Maybe had the governor when you kind of worked just a little bit more with L.J. Bryant, we had a different outcome.
Well, believe it or not, and it's hard for me to believe, but we're running out of time here. So let's talk a little bit, and I'm going to give each of you 30 seconds. What are your predictions with regard to the way the Democratic governor will work with this Republican majority legislature? And Mr. Dooley, you went first starting out, so I'll let you go first here and let Lamar have the final word.
Well, you know, Governor Beebe is a conservative Democrat. You look at what his agenda has been. He uses conservative projections for the budget. He uses conservatism as it relates to the grocery tax cuts, which will impact everyone. So from my perspective, I really do feel like the governor will work well with mainline conservatives and Republicans in the House, along with members of his own party. So I don't really see an issue from that perspective. I think the only issue that may arise will be sort of the Tea Party element in the Arkansas House, particularly, that may cause some consternation for the governor.
I will use part of that 30 seconds to go back to what he said before. The governor worked very hard for L.J. Bryan and other Democratic candidates. I mean, he was out there on the stump. He raised money. He did all those things. And I think part of the reason that Republicans didn't get that 60 vote majority they thought in the House was because the governor was out there day in, day out campaigning. I think this governor will work with whatever we have to work with. Whatever legislature that comes in January will be willing to work. I think there is a huge difference between running, as you said, and governing. Now is a chance, welcome to the party, Republicans, now is a chance for you to govern. And I think that we'll see what they're made of. We didn't get a chance to talk about Medicaid expansion, but when you look at the numbers of what they're faced with, that's an issue of governance. How are you going to tell, 7,000 people that we're going to kick you out of your long-term facility at home, elderly people, disabled people? How do you tell 250,000 Arkansans that you're not going to be covered by this? I mean, now they wear that. They will own those things. And so I think what you will see is responsible Republicans working with this governor to make sure that we take care of all Arkansans.
Well, with that, we're out of time. I'll close out the show with this. There was an old saying about China. You take China on horseback, but you've got to dismount to rule. And you come in thinking you'll change China, but China changes you. We'll see what happens with the Republicans who now have the great responsibility of governing. Thank you so much for this wonderful panel. Audience, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you. And with that, we'll see you next time.